Okay, so Harvest Moon is a master basket weaver and storyteller. Her name means a light shining forth in the midst of darkness. She has served 2 terms for the Washington Commission for Humanities and as an inquiry mind speaker, and has received grants from the Seattle Arts Commission, Bainbridge Island Arts and Humanities, Heritage Council for Arts in Residency, and young audiences. She received the Peace and Friendship Award presented by the Washington State Historical Society in recognition of her significant contributions to the understanding of Northwest Indigenous heritage. Her interest in history and vast research has earned her the title of professional speaker and storyteller. She speaks from her heart and spirit and leaves people with a different perspective of the Northwest Coastal Native Americans. Without further ado, Harvest Moon.
Oh my goodness. Did I do that? Well, Klahalia. Klahalia means hello. And like aloha, it also means goodbye. So when I finish up with storytelling this evening, you may go Klahalia Harvest Moon. Now, Klahalia is what we call the Chinook jargon, but what I like to share, it's more of a universal language. Not many people realize, but the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest had their own language. The Quinaults had their language, the Chinooks had their language, the Yakimas had their language. But when we had potlatches, which involved more than one tribe, we had a universal language that everyone could understand, and that is the Chinook jargon. Now, my name, Harvest Moon, was gifted to me by my grandfather. Like most babies, I decided to come into this world during the middle of the night. And it happened to be a night when there was a full moon. So my great grandfather knew, or my grandfather knew, that my name would be with the moon. He then realized that my tribe, the Quinault tribe, had just finished harvesting a large amount of salmon from the Quinault River. And so it was, my great grandfather knew that my name would be Harvest Moon. And much like a full moon is what I'm doing right now, sharing stories for over 3 decades. And when there's no moon, it's when I'm sitting here quietly with my puppy and weaving a basket. But I've had such a beautiful privilege to share legends throughout the Pacific Northwest and to people from all over the world. And I'm so proud to share this one legend that was gifted to me by a very prestigious storyteller named Johnny Moses. And I always begin with this legend specifically because it gives a better perspective of the, the inherited or the um, inherited storyteller, and it gives people a time to open their ears. So let's relax, settle back, and hear the dog legend. Long ago, there was a very prestigious young chief. Whenever he talked with his heart. Whenever he listened with his mind. And when anyone was in need, he was there to give. Well, because of these beautiful characteristics, people from all over came to live with him in his longhouse. And as the years went by, soon the longhouse became very cramped and crowded. So one evening, the chief raised his talking stick, and in his very kind voice, he said, "Let us all work together and we'll build the most beautiful longhouse in the Pacific Northwest." The very next day, all the people working side by side started to build this longhouse. It took over 4 years to finish the longhouse, because it's been said that that longhouse ended up to be 1 whole mile long. And on the completion, the chief jumps up on the roof of the longhouse. He faces his way to the north and he bellows, "All that can hear me can come to my potlatch." He then faced his way to the east. "All that can hear me can come to my potlatch." He continues in all 4 directions until he lost his voice. That night, people from all over came to the potlatch. The men wore their beautiful carved masks. Women adorned with their beautiful button blankets. They were singing and dancing and having a wonderful feast, when all of a sudden there was this strange knock on the longhouse wall. The chief pulled the blanket of the door open and he looked out, and to his surprise, there had been at least a dozen cadetos or dogs standing outside the door of the longhouse. Now, back in those days, when the animals spoke, our, our people could understand what they said. And the dogs barked out, "Bow, bow, bow, bow." And the dog said, "Hey, you said all that can hear you can come to your potlatch. Where's the food?" Well, the chief, lost with words for a moment, finally came forward and said, "There's been a misunderstanding. Dogs don't come to a potlatch. It's just for people." And the dogs retorted, "But you said all." "I know. No dogs allowed." Well, the dogs put their heads down and they walked to the edge of the woods, pondering over why they couldn't go to the potlatch, until one of the dogs perked up and said, "Hey, why don't we build our own longhouse, and we'll have our own potlatch, and it'll be just for dogs. Well, all the dogs working together, they built the cutest little longhouse. It was only about waist high and about as long as a potlatch canoe. And on the completion, one of the dogs jumps up on the little roof of the longhouse. He too barks in all four directions until he too loses his bark. But as the sun was falling to the west, a very old elder dog got a very worried look on his face. The younger dogs came up quietly with their ears open and their mouths closed. And the younger dogs go, why do you look so worried? We got a beautiful longhouse. There's going to be singing and dancing and feasting. Well, the old elder dog spoke and said, being it so rainy and muddy, my tail is really dirty. And if all the dogs come into the longhouse, they're gonna be so happy that the tails of the dogs will make the walls all filthy and dirty. Well, that's a good concern. Until one of the dogs perked up and said, I have the answer. All we have to do is we'll place pegs on the outside wall of the longhouse, and we'll make it a rule. Any dog who comes into the potlatch, they have to cut their tail off and hang it on the peg. Problem solved. That night, dogs from all over came to the potlatch. They all popped their tails off, hung them on the pegs. They were singing and dancing and having a wonderful feast when all of a sudden there was a strange knock on the longhouse wall. The dogs go, this is the people. And these people are gonna wanna come to our potlatch, and we're gonna tell them no people can come to our potlatch. So the dogs pulled the little blanket of the door open, and they looked out, and to their surprise, there had to have been at least 30 coyotes standing outside the door of the longhouse. Now the coyotes bellowed out, and the coyote said, hey, you said all that can hear you and come to your potlatch. Come on, cousin, let us in. Well, the dogs looked at the coyotes And they go, you have to think we're idiots. No coyotes can come to our potlatch. It is just for dogs. Well, the coyotes put their heads down and they walked to the edge of the woods, but they waited for about an hour and the coyotes snuck back, jumped up on the little roof of the longhouse. They quietly pulled back the cedar planks, and the coyotes yelled, "Fire!" Well, those dogs ran out of the longhouse. They grabbed any tail they could find and popped it on. And so, to this day, whenever you see two dogs meeting, they're still looking for their own tail. Nahashka. That, my friends, is the dog legend. Now you can see why I always bring this up. One of these days, I'm going to tell this legend. I like to have it at a dog park and have the dogs, because when I do tell this dog legends, the dogs do perk up and they listen just like the people. So it's wonderful to be a storyteller. Now, I recently 3 decades of storytelling, and it's come to my attention from 3 different distinguished storytellers that I am privileged to tell a story of mine. Now, I just don't come up and you can just come up and just start telling your story. No, it took 3 decades to get to this point. And I hemmed and hawed and wondered what legend or story. Stories are new, legends are old. Now, it all began, I worked and lived during the summer up at the beautiful Lake Quinault, and I worked at the lodge. And it is true, when you have a cabin on the lake, you end up with lots of friends, lots of family, and lots of visitors. And it was no different for this one weekend. It was the middle of August, and my son had, one of my youngest son had wanted to come up with a couple of friends. And when he brought the 2 friends up, now mind you, they're adults, they're in their mid-20s now. And when he arrived, I was kind of concerned because he brought 2 friends and him 3. Well, I always taught my sons to, when you invite people for a gathering, make it even numbers. If it's odd numbers, you're going to have a little discrepancy. And what had happened, sure enough, one morning, it was my day off, one of his friends wanted to stay and go fishing, and the other one wanted to go hiking. Well, my son was kind of mixed between the two, so I volunteered and asked, well, if this young gentleman doesn't mind hanging out with an old elder hiker, I would be proud to take him up on one of my trails, and then you could stay here and fish. Problem solved. Now, it was a beautiful Sunday afternoon, or brunch. We had a late breakfast, and it was about 11:10. Now, I remember this time because Sunday afternoons, even though it's a beautiful day, people are moving. Either they're going back home, or they're moving to a different destination, or they're just hanging out at the camp. So the trails are kind of all by ourselves. We did pass 2 couples, But then we got behind on the trails in the back end. Now, this is what happened. As you all know, when you hike, you put the old elder or the young ones in front and the fast, speedy Gonzaleses or the running hikers behind. Because if you put a running hiker in the front, they'll run off and you'll lose them. So the rule is old people first and then the fast hikers. Well, the young gentleman was behind me. And as we came around the corner, it was about the distance of about a block and a half. And now, as we came around the corner, it must have heard the two of us because I only saw it for a fraction of a second. Now, mind you, a second is fast enough, but a fraction of a second. But because it was such a strange creature, it felt like it was slow motion. Now, the kid that was with me, he didn't see it, but he saw the bushes move because when it did see, it had already had heard me and heard us and was ready to pounce and jump into the nearby stickers. And it did go into the bushes and stickers. The young gentleman said, "What was it?" And I go, "Well, seems to be a kind of like a little bear." And he goes, "A little bear?" And I said, "Well, if there's a little bear, there's usually a big bear. And when there's a big bear, it's usually a big mama bear. So it'd probably be best to probably." And by the time I turned around to say, we probably should turn around, he had already started walking back. So we turned around and went back. Now, nothing was said. The young man and my son went back to Olympia. The next day, I went back to the lodge to work. Now, my boss, Mr. Roger Blaine, was a retired park ranger, and now he had been working as a program coordinator and was my boss. Tuesday mornings are a slow day. And usually around 10 o'clock, Mr. Blaine comes out of his office, walks through the lobby, enjoying seeing all the tourists taking pictures in front of the fireplace or asking me questions of my hands on artifacts. He always grabs a cup of coffee and a biscuit with that good old butter and honey. Well, it was a quiet day. There was no one in the lobby. And quite often, Mr. Blaine would come up and we would talk over what happened over the weekend. Well, now, Mr. Blaine, mind you, I had found out he had encountered and seen Bigfoot. Now, he crossed the road. At that time, it was a gravel road and went up the cliff and was gone. Mr. Blaine had reported it. Being a ranger, he reported it, but like many people who see Bigfoot, many of them don't say that they seen him. And if they did tell people, they wish they didn't. And in this case, Mr. Blaine didn't wish that he didn't tell anybody, which made me feel comfortable to share with him when he came up to my table. I told him about the Sunday mid morning as I came around the corner. I came around the corner, and right in the middle of the trail was this creature. Now, there's all kinds of creatures of Bigfoot, baby Bigfoot, bears, cougars, bobcats. We have everything up in those deep woods. But this had the features of a bear and a woman. Mr. Blaine paused for a moment and said, "What do you mean?" Well, I wouldn't be sharing this, but it was on the trail just behind the lodge. And when I came around the corner for a split second, I've seen this creature and it dove into the woods. Mr. Blaine was concerned, so he said, "Cover up your artifacts and put your sign up saying we'll be back in 15 minutes. wanted me to report it to the ranger station. I was kind of upset by the whole thing because I didn't want to report such a half bear, half woman. I mean, I would be not only the most beautiful storyteller in the world, but I would be the most loony storyteller sharing a legend of seeing a half bear and half woman. But here we were walking across the parking lot of the lodge, me digging my heels, going, Mr. Blaine, I really don't want to report this. This is just not what I want to do today. And anyway, why would I want to report a woman taking a pee? Now, it took about 2 steps that Mr. Blaine took. And he took 2 steps and he stopped. And he turned back and he looked at me and he said, what did you say? I said, why would I report a woman taking a pee? Get it? She was squat down on the trail and her pants were pulled down. So she was half bear, half woman. Happy April Fools. Now, let's get down to the best legend ever. Long ago, the women and the children had spent most of the day picking the sweet, tiny blackberries. Now, some of the children had more berries in their tummy than they had in their baskets. Even the toddlers had more berries around their mouth than in their baskets. But to make the job, well, not so much a job, the women were finding out who was expecting a baby. They were finding out who was getting married to who. And I've been told, or oh, no. I know jokes were told that would even surprise the men. In other words, it was time for the women to let their hair down as they picked the sweet, tiny blackberries. But as the sun was falling to the west, the women started gathering their baskets of berries and returned to the village. As they were gathering the baskets, they heard a rustling in the brush. As the rustling of the brush came closer, the women motioned with just their eyes to the children who could run quickly enough and fast enough to run back to the longhouse. Now, for the children who were too young, the women quickly picked them up, held them underneath their arm, and took their head and held it close to the mother's heart. When the small children heard the fast beating of the mother's heart, they knew they had to be very quiet. As the rustling of the brush came closer, the women cupped their hands behind their ears in order to hear as well as a deer. As the rustling of the brush came closer, they knew that it wasn't deer because deer has a jumping sound through the brush. They knew that it wasn't bear. Oh, bear loved those little blackberries as much as we did. But as long as bear had no cub bear would run in the opposite direction. But as the rustling of the brush came closer, all of a sudden, there was this horrible, horrible stench. It was a smell that was as strong as a skunk, but it wasn't a skunk smell. About then, out of the brush came this huge monster. His legs were as big as tree trunks. His skin was covered with hair, and his eyes had a hypnotic red glow to them. This monster started chasing the women all through the berry patch. And as he was chasing them, he took his huge big feet and he started knocking over every basket of berries, wasting them on the ground. Now the women managed to escape and they made it back to the longhouses, and they described to their men exactly what they had seen. At first, the men thought maybe you ate a bad berry, or maybe you've been out in the sun too long, because what you describe doesn't exist. Well, days passed. The women weren't talking to the men. The women weren't looking at the men. The women weren't even feeding the men. The men decided, maybe we should go check that berry patch. When they got to the berry patch, they looked for footprints, none to be found. They looked for maybe hair that might have came off onto the sticker bushes, but there was none to be found. That night, when everyone was sound asleep, all of a sudden, the guard dogs stood up on all fours and they just froze. Now, in the past, those guard dogs would have ran out that one door and chased whatever it was that was coming. But in this case, they didn't move an inch. The hair on the back of the dogs came straight up, and for the first and only time, the dogs made a sound that went like this. Now, some of the people escaped from the secret tunnels that we had in the longhouses. Others just froze. That monster came and started throwing pieces of driftwood and large boulders on our roofs. He continued to scream and holler through the entire night. Just before the sun came up, he disappeared. Now, not having any sleep whatsoever, the salmon fishermen went down to the rivers and they started to pull up their traps. And as each of them pulled up their traps, to no surprise, not one salmon was hot. It was then that the salmon fishermen looked up the river and standing where no man would be able to stand in the skookums or the right rapids of the river stood this monster. He picked up his smelly, stinky feet and he started laughing at the salmon fishermen. It was then they realized that as long as that monster was to stand in the river with his smelly, stinky feet, that the salmon people, who live at the bottom of the ocean, will never travel up the river again. Women aren't going out to gather food. They're not getting any sleep. And now, no salmon. Now, this was happening throughout the entire Pacific Northwest. And for the first and only time, the chiefs from each tribe gathered for a meeting. One of the chief raised his talking stick and exclaimed, "Let us find the strongest warrior. We'll make a special spear that would be so sharp that it would penetrate the tough leather skin of the monster and will be rid of him forever." As soon as he spoke those words, the whale hunter raised the talking stick and said he should be the one that kills the monster because he kills whales that are 10 times as big as this monster. Then the elk hunter, he grabbed the talking stick and exclaimed that he should be the one that kills the monster because he knows the woods better than the whale hunter. Well, they argued back and forth until 4 young men brought forth this huge rock. The rock was about this big around, and they took the rock and dropped it in the middle of the floor of the longhouse. A young girl of 6 seasons came forward with a shell. In this shell was full of bear grease. She took a handful of the bear grease and she starts rubbing it all over the boulder. The warriors quickly got into a line, for whoever could carry the rock the furthest without dropping it would be the one that would kill the monster. Well, it's been said that that warrior had carried that boulder 6.5 miles up the side of a mountain and back without dropping it. After the special spear had been made, as the warrior was leaving, he stopped and asked an old elder, "By what name shall I call this monster to his death?" And the old elder spoke and said, "His name is Gloop." keep. So as he was leaving, you could hear, "Blue pig, blue pig, blue pig." Weeks passed, and the warrior never returned. The parents who lost their son had a meal in his honor, and it was after the meal that an old elder came forward. And as he came forward, everyone became very quiet. The old elder spoke and said, "Dig a hole, dig a deep hole, put some branches in over the hole, and place your prettiest maiden on the edge of the hole." At that very moment, all the people working side by side started to dig this hole. It took over 2 full moons to dig a hole deep enough that will keep the monster in the bottom of the pit. They had just placed the prettiest maiden on the very edge of the hole when they heard the rustling of the brush. Blue Pig came out of the brush, ran straight towards the maiden, made it over halfway over the hole before he finally fell through. Oh, when he hit the bottom of that pit, he started screaming and hollering so loud it created avalanches in the Olympics. The people didn't know if they should cover their ears or cover their nose. He tried to crawl up only to slide back down. Days passed. He collapsed of hunger and thirst. It was then that my ancestors had enough nerve to peer into the pit. And as they peered into the pit, they all thought, "What are we going to do with him now? I don't want to feed him. No, 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 not after what he's been doing to my tribe." One of the men raised his arm and announced, "Why don't we just take the dirt that we took out and we'll put it back in and we'll bury him alive?" Well, as we put the dirt back in, he can arrange it at different levels and escape and kill us all. A young woman, she raised her arm and announced, "Why don't we just fill the hole with water? We'll drown him." Well, as we fill the hole with water, he'd be able to float to the edge and escape and kill us all. Well, there were ideas upon ideas until finally the old elder came forward and said only 2 words: "Burn him." The people took a couple steps back. Burn this monster? His idea of captured him in the hole worked, so his idea of burning him shall also. So the people quickly got into a line from the edge of the hole all the way to the beach. In this line of people, they started passing up large pieces of driftwood and placing them at both ends of the pit on the night when there was no moon in the sky. All the people gathered around the parents who lost their son would be the one to torch the first fire. And as they were torching the first fire, there was this rustling in the brush. Are there more than one of these monsters? Are there families of these monsters? Will we be tormented for the rest of our lives with these monsters? About then, out of the brush came their son. His head was bowed low, and he didn't want to have any eye contact, for all that had happened was he had lost his way. The people quickly handed him the torch, and he would torch the last fire. And as he was bending down to torch that last fire, all of a sudden, blue cake ran from the bottom of the pit, and he yells, "You kill me. You can't get rid of me." Because, I'm going to get out. Yeah. I'm going to get out. And I'm going to bite. Yes. I'm going to bite. I'm going to bite each and every one of you and suck your blood. Oh, those people kept those fires burning for 4 days and 3 nights. The flames of the fire rose so high into the sky that the people on the other side of the Olympics actually believed Raven, the trickster, was creating a second sun from the west on the night when there was just a small crest of a moon. All the people gathered around the pit. The chief took his walking stick and he started jabbing and stirring the coals that accumulated at the bottom of the pit. And as he was stirring the coals, sparks from the fire rose high into the sky. And as they got higher, they started to cool and fall as ash. But when the ash touched the earth, it all came to life as mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks. That, my friends, is the creation of the mosquitoes. How many have you been bitten by blue key? Bigfoot, Sasquatch. That's why to this day he does not bother us at all. And when he was standing in the river with his dirty, stinky feet, it should teach us not to pollute the river. The men were the decision makers. Whenever the men made a decision, us women had to go along. But if we didn't get along with their decision, we'll stop beating, talking, and looking at the men, and the men will make a decision for what we want. So we had some power when it comes to the tummy. And always helps when, if you're doing a tedious job, in order to do a tedious job is to have fun and make jokes. So I'd love to tell more stories. And I'm so proud that there's a whole new generation of storytellers that are emerging. And if you ever hear of one coming in your area from a nearby tribe, be sure to go because they it's an art that needs to be preserved more than ever. I'd like to thank the library for inviting me for an evening of storytelling, and I will leave you with the shortest legend ever. Now you may share this legend. You have to make sure you tell that you learned it from me. A salmon went up the river and came to a dam. Nahashka. Now I can put my eyeballs on. Hi, everybody.
So Lindsay just typed in the chat there. If anybody has any questions, they can ask at this point.
Easy ones. Everybody can be a storyteller. Did you
Looks
have a
like
son on your lap earlier?
who, me?
Yeah.
Yes, I did have my son on my lap earlier.
Oh, you got a half human.
Yeah, he's a little one right now, you know, a little
Yeah.
wiggler.
What's his name?
Olin.
Oh, I hope he enjoyed the stories.
He went to bed already.
Oh, hey,
Yeah.
ironically, when I tell stories to groups of people, there's always one or two that'll fall asleep. And when a couple people fall asleep, that's actually a sign of a good storyteller, you know, because you lull them. They're listening to the story in their spirit.
Yeah, it's already his bedtime anyway, so.
Uh-huh. And be sure to come. I got my walking stick. Be sure to come next month. I'm hoping to do the culty legend and maybe the spirit of rolling rocks. I'm not sure which ones you've chosen yet. I have a repertoire of 7 different legends now. With the cootie germ, it's allowed me to uh, kind of uh, make the stories, revise them, and make them prettier. And then I made 3 new legends that I've created. And so being in the cootie German helped me do more stories.
The silver lining, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Everybody's so quiet.
We got a question here for you. What can you say about the purpose of stories? It seemed from my view that each story had multiple lessons in it. And that was from Joseph.
Stories, the storytellers were were as important, if as important as a chief or a shaman or a medicine man, because the storyteller's main objective is to portray a story that teaches the morals, like I mentioned earlier, the morals. We didn't have a written language, so the stories were all memorized. Now, as I'm get older now, my work will be one of my younger boys. I will download all my stories to them and they will carry the stories on. And so, and best of all, they were very important for entertainment, during the long winter's months, and it gives a better perspective of humor and and a learning process. Oh, I can have some tea.
Somebody asked, what is your favorite animal?
It has to be an otter. My animal crest is sea otter, and on my button blanket is a little otter on the back, and it's perched with a little basket on it. Sea otter loves to tease. My favorite holiday is April Fool's Day. Sea otter loves seafood. I could eat seafood breakfast, lunch, dinner. And sea otter is the same color as my hair. So sea otter is my favorite animal, but all the animals are my favorite. You know, when I see an eagle, even though I've seen eagles numerous times, whenever you see an eagle, isn't it like it's the first time you've ever seen one? They are so gorgeous.
What stories do storytellers tell each other? Allison asks.
Oh, the storytellers. There are actually three different, may I say, phases of storytellers. There, during the evening, the first storyteller that comes up and tells his or her stories can tell stories from newborn to elder. And as Johnny Moses mentions, I'm notorious at being very good at telling legends to newborn to elder. When the small children, like grade school kids, when they fall asleep, then there's a second storyteller that takes on the stage. And the second storyteller gets a little bit more intricate and more into um, uh, the late night storytelling. Then, when the middle school and high school kids fall asleep, then there's the third storyteller, and he or she could make Stephen King look like a nursery rhyme writer. Irene, the stories are the Spirit of Rolling Rocks has a little tad bit of Stephen King in it, and it just gives a better perspective of an entertaining evening. And like the Bigfoot legend, teaches the toddlers to stay close to the longhouse so we don't lose them, right? Or constantly having to tell them, get back here, stay out of there. Oh, don't go out the woods, you know. You just scare them and they stay close to the longhouses. So we had ways of getting rules done around the longhouses.
All right. Well, before we say Klahawia, I want to remind everybody that we have, a survey for folks to fill out, that's how we, know what kind of programs people want. So if you could do that, we ask you to please do so.
There's some good ones coming up too. I want to check some of them out. Well, thank you guys for showing up, and enjoy those frogs and the spring and the flowers, and stay safe and sound. We're making through this one way or another, right?
For sure, for sure.
Thanks so much, Harvest Moon. Thanks everybody for coming. See you all in April. All right.
Yes. Bye.
Bye, everyone.